The screams echoed through the opulent halls of the Troitskoy estate as another young servant girl met her horrific end at the hands of her mistress. But this wasn't some medieval tale of feudal brutality. This was 18th century Russia, during the supposed age of enlightenment, and the woman responsible for these murders was Darya Saltykova, one of the most sadistic serial killers in Russian history. For over a decade, this wealthy noblewoman tortured and murdered her own household servants for no reason other than her own twisted pleasure, killing an estimated 138 people before her reign of terror was finally exposed. Her story reveals the darkest side of Russian serfdom and proves that absolute power in the hands of a psychopath can create horrors that defy imagination. Welcome back to History Grandpa, where we uncover the darkest and most shocking secrets from the past. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases of serial murder in Russian history. A story that shows how unchecked power and social inequality can create monsters who hide behind wealth and privilege. Picture this: the year is 1756, and Imperial Russia is basking in the glory of the Enlightenment era. Empress Elizabeth Petrovna sits on the throne. French philosophy dominates intellectual circles, and Russia is modernizing at breakneck speed. Yet in the countryside estates of the Russian nobility, a different reality exists, one where human beings are treated as property, where the law offers no protection to the powerless, and where sadistic individuals can commit atrocities without fear of consequences. Into this world was born Darya Saltykova, a woman whose name would become synonymous with cruelty and whose crimes would eventually shock even the hardened Russian aristocracy. Born around 1730 to the wealthy Ivanov family, Darya grew up in a world of absolute privilege, where her every whim was indulged and her actions faced no meaningful consequences. Her family owned vast estates, worked by thousands of serfs, and from childhood she learned to view these human beings not as people, but as objects to be used and discarded at will. The young Darya displayed disturbing behavior from an early age that should have served as warning signs of the monster she would become. Servants later testified that even as a child she showed an unusual fascination with causing pain to others, particularly those who couldn't fight back. She would deliberately spill hot tea on servants' hands, stick them with pins during dress fittings, and fly into violent rages when her demands weren't met with sufficient speed and deference. Her parents, typical of their class and era, saw nothing wrong with their daughter's behavior. In their world, serfs existed solely to serve the nobility, and any treatment of them was considered acceptable as long as it didn't damage valuable property. The concept that serfs might have feelings, dignity, or rights was foreign to their thinking. They viewed Darya's cruelty as a sign of her strong will and natural authority, rather than as evidence of a deeply disturbed personality. Darya's marriage to Gleb Saltykov in 1750 initially seemed to moderate her behavior, perhaps because she now had an outlet for her energies in managing her own household. Gleb was a minor nobleman who brought little wealth to the marriage but provided Darya with social respectability and the freedom to manage their combined estates as she saw fit. The couple settled at Troitskoy, a sprawling estate about 60 miles from Moscow, where they lived in luxury supported by the labor of hundreds of serfs. For the first few years of their marriage, Darya seemed to channel her energies into the socially acceptable activities of a noble housewife. She supervised the household servants, managed the estate's domestic operations, and maintained the social connections expected of someone of her rank. Servants from this period later testified that while she was demanding and quick to anger, her punishments were within the normal range of what serfs expected from their masters. The transformation began gradually after Glebe's death in 1755, when Darya found herself a wealthy widow with absolute control over her estates and no male authority figure to moderate her behavior. Russian law gave widows unprecedented power over their deceased husband's property, and Darya used this legal freedom to indulge her darkest impulses without restraint. The death of her husband seems to have removed the last barrier between her sadistic urges and their fulfillment. The first documented murder occurred in early 1756, when a young housemaid named Praskovia was found dead in Darya's private chambers under suspicious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as an accident, but other servants whispered that they had heard screams coming from the room and had seen Darya emerge with blood on her clothes. This initial killing seems to have awakened something in Darya that had been dormant during her marriage, unleashing an appetite for violence that would consume her for the next decade. What made Darya's crimes particularly heinous was not just their brutality, but their calculated nature. She didn't kill in fits of rage or passion, but seemed to plan and savor each murder as a form of entertainment. She would select her victims carefully, often choosing the youngest and most vulnerable servants, and would then create pretexts for punishing them that would justify increasingly severe treatment. A broken dish, a perceived slight, or simply moving too slowly could become the excuse for hours of torture that would inevitably end in death. The methods Darya used to kill her. Victims revealed a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and psychology that made her crimes even more disturbing. She had clearly studied the most effective ways to cause maximum pain while prolonging life, ensuring that her victims would suffer for as long as possible before death finally released them. She used a variety of techniques, from scalding water and burning implements to more creative methods that demonstrated her twisted imagination. The psychological manipulation that preceded the physical violence was equally calculated. Darya would often single out victims days or weeks before killing them, subjecting them to increasing levels of abuse and terror while making it clear that their fate was inevitable. She seemed to derive as much pleasure from the anticipation and fear she created as from the actual acts of violence. This systematic approach to terrorizing her victims shows a level of premeditation that goes far beyond simple sadism. The selection of victims followed a clear pattern that revealed Darya's calculating nature. She typically chose young women who were new to her household, had no family connections that might cause problems, or were somehow isolated from the other servants. She showed a particular preference for attractive young women, possibly out of jealousy or sexual motivation, though the exact psychological drivers behind her victim selection remain unclear. The household staff at Troitskoye lived in constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for Darya's attention. Servants later testified that the atmosphere in the house was one of constant dread with everyone walking on eggshells and trying to avoid any action that might trigger their mistress's wrath. Many servants attempted to flee the estate, but Russian law made it virtually impossible for serfs to escape their masters, and those who were caught attempting to leave faced punishment that often proved fatal. The isolation of the Troitskoye estate worked in Darya's favor, allowing her to commit her crimes without outside interference. The nearest authorities were dozens of miles away, and even if they had been closer, the legal system of the time offered no protection for serfs against their masters. Russian law explicitly stated that nobles had the right to punish their serfs as they saw fit, and this legal framework provided Darya with effective immunity from prosecution. The complicity of other household staff in Darya's crimes raises disturbing questions about the moral environment she created. While some servants were clearly victims themselves, others seem to have assisted in her crimes, either out of fear for their own lives or because they had been corrupted by the atmosphere of violence and cruelty. The estate became a closed system where normal moral restraints had completely broken down, allowing increasingly extreme behavior to become normalized. The economic impact of Darya's murders was significant, as she was literally destroying her own property through her actions. In the Russian serf system, each dead servant represented a substantial financial loss, but Darya's wealth was so vast that she could afford to indulge her murderous impulses without facing immediate economic consequences. This economic insulation allowed her to continue her killing spree far longer than would have been possible for someone with more limited resources. The turning point in Darya's career came in 1762, when the death of Empress Elizabeth and the ascension of Catherine II brought new attention to the treatment of serfs throughout the Russian Empire. Catherine, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, was more concerned with the welfare of her subjects than her predecessor had been, and reports of extreme cruelty toward serfs began to receive more serious consideration from the authorities. The case that finally brought Darya to justice began with the murder of a serf named Savely Martynov in 1762. Unlike her previous victims, Martynov was a skilled craftsman whose death could not be easily explained away as an accident. More importantly, he had relatives who were willing to risk everything to seek justice for his death. These relatives petitioned local officials, and when they were ignored, they took the extraordinary step of appealing directly to the Imperial Court in St. Petersburg. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Darya's crimes for the first time. Imperial investigators interviewing survivors and examining records found evidence of systematic murder spanning over 6 years. The testimony they collected painted a picture of cruelty so extreme that it shocked even hardened officials who were accustomed to dealing with the violence of Russian society. The evidence against Darya was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses testified to her crimes. Physical evidence was found throughout the estate, and her own behavior during the investigation suggested guilt rather than innocence. She showed no remorse for her actions and seemed to view the investigation as an inconvenience rather than a serious legal proceeding. This attitude further convinced the investigators that they were dealing with someone who was fundamentally different from normal human beings. The trial of Darya Saltykova became a sensation throughout the Russian Empire. It was one of the first cases where a member of the high nobility was prosecuted for crimes against serfs, and it represented a significant shift in how the Russian legal system viewed the treatment of the lower classes. The proceedings were closely followed by the educated public, who were shocked by the revelations about what had been happening in the Russian countryside. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of Darya's crimes. Official court records documented 138 murders, though investigators believe the actual number was probably much higher. The victims ranged in age from young children to elderly servants, with the majority being young women between the ages of 15 and 25. The systematic nature of the killings, combined with the clear evidence of premeditation and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendant, convinced the court that they were dealing with one of the most dangerous criminals in Russian history. The sentence handed down by the court reflected the severity of Darya's crimes. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, a punishment that was considered extremely harsh by the standards of the time. More significantly, she was stripped of all her titles and properties, reducing her from one of the wealthiest women in Russia to a common prisoner. This aspect of the sentence was particularly important because it demonstrated that even the highest members of society were subject to the law. The conditions of Darya's imprisonment were deliberately harsh, designed to ensure that she would never again be able to harm another human being. She was confined to a small cell in a Moscow monastery, allowed no visitors, and given only the most basic necessities for survival. The isolation was intended to be both punishment and protection, ensuring that she could neither escape nor influence others to help her. Darya's reaction to her imprisonment revealed the depth of her psychological disturbance. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to justify her actions, she seemed to view her punishment as a personal affront that she didn't deserve. Prison officials reported that she remained defiant and unrepentant throughout her confinement, never acknowledging the suffering she had caused or expressing any regret for her actions. The impact of Darya's case extended far beyond her individual punishment. It became a catalyst for broader discussions about the treatment of serfs in Russian society and contributed to gradual reforms in the legal system. The case demonstrated that the absolute power traditionally enjoyed by the nobility could be abused in ways that threatened the stability of society itself, leading to increased oversight of noble households and greater protection for serfs. The international reaction to Darya's case was equally significant. European observers, already critical of Russian serfdom, used her crimes as evidence of the inherent barbarity of the Russian system. The case became a source of national embarrassment for Russia and contributed to pressure for social reforms that would eventually lead to the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The psychological analysis of Darya's behavior, limited as it was by the scientific understanding of the time, revealed patterns that would later be recognized as characteristic of serial killers. Her careful selection of victims, her escalating violence, and her complete lack of empathy for her victims all fit the profile of what modern psychologists would classify as a psychopathic personality disorder. The social context that allowed Darya's crimes to continue for so long reveals the dangers of systems that concentrate absolute power in the hands of individuals without adequate oversight or accountability. The Russian serf system created conditions where vulnerable people could be victimized without recourse, and where social isolation allowed extreme behavior to develop unchecked. The economic factors that contributed to Darya's crimes cannot be ignored. Her vast wealth provided her with the resources to continue her killing spree while insulating her from the normal consequences of her actions. This economic power also allowed her to maintain the isolated environment where her crimes could take place without outside interference. The gender dynamics of Darya's case were particularly complex. As a woman in a patriarchal society, she was expected to be nurturing and protective, especially toward those under her care. Her violation of these gender expectations made her crimes seem even more shocking to contemporary observers, who struggled to understand how a woman could commit such acts of violence. The religious implications of Darya's case were also significant. As a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, she was expected to show mercy and compassion to those less fortunate than herself. Her complete disregard for Christian principles, combined with her targeting of the most vulnerable members of society, made her crimes seem like a direct challenge to the religious foundations of Russian society. The legal precedent established by Darya's case was crucial for the development of Russian jurisprudence. It demonstrated that the law could be applied to members of the highest social classes, and that certain crimes were so serious that they transcended traditional social boundaries. This principle would become increasingly important as Russian society modernized and moved away from feudal relationships. The imprisonment of Darya Saltykova lasted for over 30 years, during which she became something of a legendary figure in Russian criminal history. Stories about her crimes were passed down through oral tradition, often becoming exaggerated in the telling, but preserving the essential truth about her systematic cruelty. These stories served as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of treating all human beings with dignity and respect. The end of Darya's story came in 1801, when she died in her prison cell at the age of approximately 71. Her death was noted in official records but generated little public interest, as she had long since been forgotten by all but a few historians and legal scholars. The woman who had once been one of the most powerful individuals in Russia died alone and unmourned, a fitting end to a life that had been devoted to causing suffering to others. The legacy of Darya Saltykova extends far beyond her individual crimes. Her case became a symbol of the excesses of the Russian aristocracy and contributed to the social reforms that would eventually transform Russian society. The legal principles established by her prosecution helped create a more equitable justice system, while the publicity surrounding her case increased public awareness of the need to protect vulnerable members of society. Modern historians have continued to study Darya's case as an example of how social and economic systems can create conditions that allow extreme criminal behavior to flourish. Her story serves as a reminder that the protection of human rights requires constant vigilance, and that societies must be structured to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of individuals who might abuse it. The psychological profile of Darya Saltykova reveals patterns that have been observed in serial killers throughout history. Her escalating violence, her careful selection of victims, and her complete lack of empathy all fit the characteristics of what modern experts recognize as psychopathic behavior. Her case provides valuable insights into the development and expression of extreme antisocial behavior, the social conditions that allowed Darya's crimes to continue for so long highlight the importance of systems that protect vulnerable individuals from abuse. The isolation of her estate, the legal immunity she enjoyed as a noble, and the lack of oversight of her activities all contributed to creating an environment where extreme criminal behavior could flourish unchecked. The economic factors that enabled Darya's crimes demonstrate the dangers of extreme wealth inequality. Her vast resources allowed her to maintain the isolation necessary for her crimes while insulating her from the normal consequences of her actions. This economic power also enabled her to corrupt or intimidate those who might have opposed her, creating a system where resistance to her authority was virtually impossible. The gender aspects of Darya's case reveal the complex ways in which social expectations can both constrain and enable criminal behavior. As a woman, she was expected to be nurturing and protective, but her wealth and social position gave her power that she used to violate these expectations in the most extreme ways possible. Her case challenges simple assumptions about gender and violence while highlighting the importance of social accountability, regardless of gender. The religious dimensions of Darya's crimes highlight the gap between professed beliefs and actual behavior that can exist in societies where religious observance is more about social conformity than genuine spiritual commitment. Her complete disregard for Christian principles of mercy and compassion, despite her nominal membership in the Russian Orthodox Church, reveals the dangers of religious systems that lack mechanisms for holding their members accountable for their actions. The international impact of Darya's case extended beyond Russia's borders, contributing to European discussions about human rights and the treatment of vulnerable populations. Her crimes became evidence in arguments against systems of forced labor and aristocratic privilege, helping to build momentum for social reforms throughout Europe. The educational value of Darya's story lies not in the sensational details of her crimes, but in what it reveals about the conditions that can allow such behavior to develop and persist. Her case serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, social isolation, and systems that fail to protect vulnerable individuals from abuse. The horrific story of Darya Saltykova serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of someone without moral constraints, and how social systems that fail to protect the vulnerable can enable the worst forms of human behavior. Her decade-long reign of terror, which claimed 138 innocent lives, demonstrates that evil can flourish when wealth, privilege, and legal immunity combine to create an environment where cruelty faces no consequences. If you found this disturbing but important historical story as eye-opening as I did, make sure to subscribe to History Grandpa for daily videos that explore the darkest chapters of human history and the lessons they teach us about power, justice, and the protection of human dignity. And don't forget to like this video to help us share these crucial stories that remind us why strong institutions, equal justice under law, and protection for the vulnerable remain essential for preventing such horrors from recurring. These stories may be difficult to confront, but they're vital for understanding how societies can fail their most vulnerable members and what we must do to ensure that such failures never happen again.